The Little Black Coal by Ethel Cook Eliot. Chapter 1. How the Story Began. This is the story of the little black coal, who stood in the top of the coal scuttle. He told it himself, and since things cannot lie, you may know it is true. The nursery, where the little coal told his story, was bright and warm, but outside it was a bitter cold winter day. The 4 children, whose nursery it was, were all gathered at one of the dormer windows, their faces flattened against the pane, looking down into the street. They were counting the umbrellas being blown inside out, and the men who must chase their hats. They laughed with delight when either of these things happened, and they heard not a word that the little black coal was saying. It was the new, bright copper coal scuttle who started it. He said suddenly, and brightly, with a clinking laugh, "Poor coal, how very soon there will be an end to you. When the blaze on the hearth gets a little lower, you must leave my arms and be thrown into the fire. Then you will burn, and just to keep those thoughtless children warm, alas!" It was a little rough, black piece of coal in the top of the coal scuttle, who answered for all his brothers. "Yes, that is so, but I am not complaining, nor are any of my brothers here. So keep your pity to yourself, please." The coal scuttle was ruffled at the rebuff. Of course his pity had been pretended. You had only to look into his smug, bright little face to know that. He answered now crossly, "You have a way of speaking as though you were a king among things. That is silly, I can tell you, in a little rough black coal who is so soon to end his days in the fire." The little coal was not ruffled, and in spite of his blackness and roughness, there was pride in his voice, as though he might indeed be a king among things. He said, "I do not boast of being a king among things, as my brother the diamond does, but I am very ancient, even so, and the ages that I have lived have left much wisdom with me, so I do not need your pity, little scuttle." "Little," cried the coal scuttle, truly angry now, for there were few things in the nursery who cared to speak so plainly to him. "Why, at this very minute I am holding up dozens of you, dirty black coals, and hardly giving it a thought. Don't call me little." Now the tall old clock interrupted. There was a gentle kindliness about him that made him much loved in the nursery. "You say you are ancient, coal. I am old too. Age gives us wonderful gifts. How old are you?" asked the little coal, looking up at the clock with interest, for he heard friendliness in his mellow tones. "I am over 100 years old," said the clock, with proud dignity. "Yes, little coal, 100 years have brought me their gifts of wisdom." "Oh, but 100 years!" cried the little rough black coal. "Excuse me, friend, but that is such a little bit of time. To me, you are a newborn." The tall old clock was not disturbed. His 100 years had taught him kindness and patience at last. "How old are you then?" he asked quietly. "Why, I am millions of years old," said the little rough black coal. He said it softly, but so clearly that everything in the nursery heard. "Millions! That is hundreds of thousands!" cried the blue rug, amazed. "That cannot be. You would be older than the pyramids." But the little coal did not trouble to answer that. All the things in the nursery fell silent then, for they knew that the coal had spoken truth. How did they know that? Why, because things cannot lie. It is just one of the things they simply cannot manage any more than people can manage to fly. But things can wonder, and now they were wondering indeed. The tall old clock at last spoke for them all. "If you are millions of years old, Cole, you must have a tale to tell." "Yes, indeed, I have a tale to tell." "Oh, do then," cried the fire screen, and all the other things in the room cried, "Please do tell us your story. Only you must hurry," warned the coal scuttle, not very kindly, "for the fire will be dying down soon, and then you will be thrown into it. Begin at the beginning, and talk as fast as you can." All the things fell silent to listen. Chapter 2. The Laughing Pinecone. So the little rough black coal stood in the top of the coal scuttle and told his story. The other coals under and around him listened carefully and with interest, and that was very polite of them, for the story he was telling was their story too, and so no new thing. They did not interrupt, even when they thought he was getting it a little wrong, for they knew that no two things would tell a story exactly the same way, even when both were right. As for the other things, the tall old clock, the blue rug, the new bright coal scuttle, and the rest, they listened breathless, for it was all new and amazing to them. "Hundreds of thousands of years ago, when I was born," said the little coal, "the world was very different from the world you know now. If I could only show you it as it was then, you would hardly believe it was the world at all. Of course, it was a young world. Then," interrupted the blue rug, "the blue rug was the best educated of the things in the nursery, for she knew more about history and geography and people than even the tall old clock. That was because she was older than the clock, and she had been born in a faraway land, and had traveled over great countries and the Atlantic Ocean, to come to this snug, safe nursery. But her learning failed her now." "No, you are wrong," said the little coal. "The world was not so very young then. It was already thousands and thousands of years old, but it was much younger than it is now. So was I." "Get on with the story," warned the coal scuttle, with an eye on the fire, which was already not quite so bright. But the coal was not to be hurried like that. He went on calmly. "A long, long time before I was born, this world was part of the sun, my mother told me. In the sun's fast spinning round and round, some great pieces were flung from it. One of them was the world, and the others were the planets. The world was still spinning faster than it is spinning now when I first grew. The air was thick with steam, and the days were all one storm after another of warm wind and rain. My mother was a tree. "How can that be?" cried the blue rug, interrupting again. "You are mineral, little coal. Anyone can see that, and a tree is a plant. Only listen, and you will learn all as I go along," answered the coal. "The story is true, for you know yourselves that things cannot lie." "Go on," murmured the things, motioning the blue rug to be silent. "My mother was not like any tree that you ever saw. She was a great, big, beautiful giant of a tree, 3 times as tall as this house we are now in. I was her youngest child. She held me the highest of all her children, straight up towards the sky and the whirling sun, as far as she could reach. The sun was moving much faster across the sky than it is now, I notice. It was like a chariot, all red and gold. I never tired of watching it. Much of the time I could not see it at all, for it was rolling along out of sight behind the thick mist and the wild, black storms. But I would wait for it, and it never failed me. Sooner or later, there it would come, grandly rolling again, hot and splendid. I would dance in my mother's arms then, and reach up to it a tiptoe. And my mother never laughed at me for that, although she and I both knew that the great sun was so great and so far above us that he never saw us or thought about us at all. "But what were you?" asked the tall old clock. "The topmost branch of your mother tree?" "No, I was not a branch. I was a cone, but I was much larger than the cones that are growing on the pine trees now. My mother stood with her feet in the water, and her sister and brother trees had taken care to grow very close to the water too, for at that time plants had not learned to live on the dry land. I could not see down through my mother's thick-growing cones to the water below, but she told me that it was covered with green scum, and that mosses and ferns were growing up through the scum, plants that never saw the light of day. There were no flowers in the world at all then, and no leaves." "What an ugly world it must have been," shuddered the scuttle. "A world without flowers and leaves, and the dry land all bare, and trees and ferns growing up out of dirty scum." "Well, it didn't seem ugly to my mother and me," cried the little black coal. "Listen, and I will tell you why." Chapter 3. The Great Plan. The little black coal was excited now, for the first time since he had been brought into the nursery. It was the memory of those far-off days when he was young, and the longing to make all the things in the nursery see it as he saw it, that stirred him. It was a strange and marvelous world, and I was only too glad to be alive in it, I can tell you. I was jolliest, perhaps, when the sudden dark storms came, for then my mother would toss me high in her arms, right up against the dark sky, I felt, and all the time she would sing songs for us, wild, new songs. Oh, the storm times were the jolliest. But what I really liked best was listening to my mother's stories. They were true stories, of course, for trees, no more than things, can tell lies. They were so wonderful, though, that it was sometimes hard to see how they could be true. She had learned most of them from the sun. They were stories about the stars, and the earth, and the vast spaces, but best of all were the stories about the plan. But there the tall old clock asked, puzzled, how could your mother, the tree, have her stories from the sun? Friend, when you yourself have already said that the sun was too far from the earth even to know about you at all. But the little coal did not waver. He knew very well what he was talking about. He said to the tall old clock, "It is true that the sun knew nothing of my mother, the tree, for big and beautiful and great as she was not even a pinpoint to the eyes of the sun. But even so, the sun's warmth and light reached us well enough between the storms. That warmth and light carried with it all the wisdom of the sun. My mother drank it up through her bark and her branches. Even I stored up the sunshine in my smaller body." "Yes, I understand now," said the tall old clock. "Excuse my interruption, please, and go on with your story. What were you saying about the plan being the best of all the stories? What was the plan?" "Well, it was because my mother knew about the plan that she was glad to grow there with her feet in the slime. The plan was that trees and ferns and mosses should begin that way, drawing their food more from the water than the air. But some day, the plan promised, they should free themselves of the water and dare to go up to live on dry land. Some day, my mother told me, the dry land will be covered with soft grass and mosses. It will be a garden. Delicate leaves and flowers will grow on the trees then, instead of rough cones like you. Yes, the flowers on the earth will be as many and as bright as the stars in the sky. The earth's bare, brown, rough body will be wrapped about with color and life. Even the water creatures will have freed themselves then, at least some of them. They too will go up to live on dry land. By then, littlest cone, you and I shall have done with the scum forever." But the plan promised even better things than that. It said that when the world was so beautiful as that, it would be a fit place for men. We could hardly believe what the plan said about the men that were to live on the earth, creatures without roots in the ground, who were to move about as they pleased, and be so strange and wonderful. But my mother said the plan was perfect, and would go on, changing the earth and the life upon it, making everything more wonderful forever. Now at last I have lived to see that she was right. But here the scuttle laughed, not very pleasantly. "Tell us, little coal, what good does all this age and wisdom do you, since in just a few minutes you are to end it all in the fire here in the grate?" "The plan will take care of that. Don't trouble yourself, please," said the little rough black coal. But the other things in the nursery were annoyed by the coal scuttle's unkindness. Moreover, the tall old clock's face told them plainly that time was passing, and they were very anxious to hear all of the coal's story before he should be thrown into the fire. "Well, well," said the fire screen softly. "You were vegetable then, and that was hundreds of thousands of years ago. You are a little black piece of mineral now, here in this nursery, and it is today. Go on, please, friend, and tell us how this marvelous thing came to be." The little black coal waited a minute, until all the things had settled into silence again, and then he continued. Chapter 4. The Storm. My mother, the tree, stood in the marshy ground, at the side of a great dark rushing river, just a little way below us. The river leapt, roaring into the sea. For miles around, the blue of the sea was turned golden brown by the rush of the dirty flood, for the river was very, very dirty. It was full of mud and sand and uprooted trees and lost mosses. It was like no river you ever saw. It was wild, and it was terrible. Even I, so high and safe above it, was afraid of it, for many, many times I saw little cones like myself being hurled along by it toward the sea. Oh, how glad I am that my mother holds me up so safe and high in the sun. I used to sing. I am sorry for my brothers, the cones carried to the sea by the rushing river. Where are their mothers? Why did they not hold them safe and high too? What will become of them now? One morning, as I was singing that song to myself and the wind, a great, ill-natured fly, bigger than me, for flies were enormous then, passed and heard my song. He whirred about and came buzzing close to me. "Don't feel so safe, my young cone," he cried. "Yours will perhaps be a worse end. Would you rather be buried in the green, evil-smelling slime at your mother's feet?" Then he flew away, and for a long time I was silent. After a while, my mother spoke softly through the wind to me. She, who had so many hundreds of cones to think of and care for, still had time to notice that I had stopped dancing and singing. "What is the matter, littlest cone?" she asked me. So I told her of the ugly words of the fly. "Don't let it stop you dancing," she said, "and don't be afraid of anything. The plan will put you where you will do the most good. Think only of that, and dance in my stretched arms. Look at the sun and the moon and the stars, and store up their wisdom in your little body. It will see you through whatever may happen." So I was light-hearted again, and danced and sang, and reached up towards the great rolling sun. But that very night the fly's words came true. I was thrown down into the scum. This is how it happened. Just as the sun was about to set behind the sea, black storm clouds suddenly rushed across his face, and then came racing to blacken the whole sky. The wind came with them, and suddenly my mother swayed, as I had never felt her sway before in all the storms of my life. Her cones were knocked together and lashed about. At first I thought it was great fun. I was the topmost cone, you see, and I was whipped and tossed more than any other. I jumped and laughed gleefully. But all of a sudden, the wind took a new and strange hold on me. It bent me quite over, and snapped me away from my mother. I cried out to her, but it could do no good. I went whirling down, 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 past all my happy, safe brothers, and lay in the slime at her feet. There I stayed among the decaying weeds and ferns, and looked up at my mother mournfully. It was only very dimly that I could see her, towering there above me. In fact, the light down there in the slime was as dim as the light in a coal bin. It was a new, dark, and queer-smelling world I had come to, but my mother spoke down to me out of the dimness. It was the last time I was to hear words of hers. For many hundreds of thousands of years, it is part of the plan, little cone, do not fret. After that I was calmer. All that night I felt myself sinking deeper and deeper into the scum, and it was thousands upon thousands of years before I was to see the sun's light again, for before morning I was all the way under. But soon I learned that the very scum I was buried in, and all the decaying things about me, were speaking of the plan too. Yes, even down there in the dark. Some day, they were saying, our sisters and brothers up on the earth will escape up onto dry land, and make a garden. They will learn how to flower, and the rough brown earth will grow a green carpet of waving grass. But meanwhile, what is to become of us, who are buried here so deep that there is no hope of our ever getting up into the sunshine? I cried. Our fate is a different one, I heard on every side. The plan will not waste even the littlest of us. So I listened to them and grew calmer. Chapter 5. What the Coal Learned. And soon I was glad to find that I was not alone with the green scum and the buried ferns and mosses. Some of my brother cones had followed me. Some, even of the great trees, like my mother, had been uprooted by the dangerous flood, and had come thundering down to lie near me, or to press me deeper and deeper into the earth. We were decaying fast, and changing our appearance. Soon you would never have known me for a cone at all, but still we knew each other, and spoke together of the glorious sun, and the air, and the winds, and the storms up on earth, and we never forgot about the plan. Those of us above passed news of that upper world down to us below, and that is how one day we heard that the earth just above was flooded by the sea. The earth is changing its levels. There are earthquakes somewhere near, cried my brothers. The place where we once grew in the sunshine is now just part of the vast sea with nothing growing up on it. Then my mother has fallen, I thought, and I was sorry for her. She was too grand and beautiful to be pressed into the scum. If only she could have pierced down through the layers of soil and scum to me. I sighed. I had no hope of ever seeing her again. But I was wrong. My mother had not fallen. In spite of the flooding sea, she was still standing, only her head above water, it is true, and she was to stay straight and fine as ever through the ages and ages that were to come. You shall hear how that was later, when I come to it." "Well, well, only do hurry," murmured the coal scuttle, uneasily, for even he, in spite of himself, was by now truly interested in the little coal's story, and he did very much want to be finished before the little coal should be thrown into the fire. The coal smiled. "It is rather queer to be hurried now, when for ages and ages and ages I have been traveling towards this same fire. No, the life I have led for the past hundreds of thousands of years has taught me much, but not how to hurry, but only be patient, and I think there will be time to finish." Sand was brought by all the new rivers that came rushing to the new sea. Slowly it sifted down upon the mud that already covered us. In time, that is, in thousands of years, it filled up the sea. By that time, though, it had hardened into sandstone, and it pressed hard upon us. That changed our appearance even more. We too hardened, and became like stone ourselves. The sandstone spoke down through the hard-caked mud, and told us of what was going on in the upper air. "We have filled up the bed of the sea," it boasted, "and now it is all swampy marsh, again like the place you first knew. A new forest is growing there. The sun is moving across the sky, so slowly these days that you can hardly see that he moves at all. The sun, too, is changing. We took up the word. Of course, he is part of the plan, too. A great tree pressing down upon us said, 'Everything that is part of the plan and changes.' Well, after a long time, the new forest that had grown in the marsh overhead in its turn began to decay. The old ferns and mosses, some of them as big as trees, toppled over into the slime to give room to new ferns and mosses in the upper air. And it was no time at all, as coal must count time, before the whole new forest lay decaying in the marshes as we had lain." Here the blue rug had a word. "That reminds me," she said, "of the peat bogs of Ireland. Isn't it true that that very same thing is happening there now? And the country people, I have heard, dig out those decaying chunks of trees and ferns for their hearth fires. They call it peat." "Yes, I was once peat," the little coal took up his story again. "And if there had been people in the world then as there are now, we too might not have had to wait all these ages. But there were no people then who needed fire, and so those peat bogs sank away and away. And were covered deeper and deeper by the sands, and the mud, and the seas. For there were many, many earthquakes, and the earth was forever changing its levels, and many forests were buried over us, between then and now. We were growing harder and harder with the heat from the earth's center, under us, and the pressure of things over and around us, and the time. But now the little black coal saw by the faces of the things listening that they thought he had had a hard life of it. "You must not think it was dull for us," he said hurriedly. "It was very interesting truly, only listen." Chapter 6. A Wonderful New World. The things listening to the little black coal's story plainly showed by their faces that they did not see how such a life, buried down so deep in the earth, could be interesting. But they were glad to listen. He went on, "You see, we were changing, growing blacker and wiser and harder, and it is always fun to be alive when one is changing and growing wiser, deep down there in the earth." We were, of course, at the very center of the life that had long ago been the upper earth, and got its wisdom from the sun, and then, too, news of the world itself was coming down to us all the time. But more than the interest of what others told us, or of what we told each other, was the interest of listening to the sun's wisdom that was stored in our own bodies. Oh, a thing that has drunk sunshine for days and days, and then been buried deep in the earth for ages and ages, has a store of thoughts, I can tell you, and cannot be dull. But the best thing the sun taught us was the wisdom of patience. You had need of that wisdom, I should say. The fire screen could not help whispering, but the coal went on without hearing. The news that came to us was all good news, great news. You may know how glad we were the day we heard that a few of our brothers and sisters had at last broken their long slavery to the marshes and the dangerous rivers, and gone up to live by themselves on dry land. All over the round world, we heard, they were pressing forward by thousands, up out of the marshes and the lagoons, and breathing freely at last on the hills. And as they passed up the hillsides and onto the mountains, they made the earth bright with starry flowers, and the waving sunny grasses that were their banners of freedom. But more wonderful news was to follow. That was news of animals that did not need to swim in the water, or even live with their feet in the earth, but could move about anywhere freely as they desired. And of course the greatest of all the news was the news of man. Oh, surely there was no end to the marvels of the plan. When the stories of cities and kings and armies and bridges and ships and engines came down to us, we said to one another, "Well, it will be hard to believe this." But in spite of our words, we knew that it must all be true, for things cannot lie. And then the sunshine stored in us murmured, "There is nothing too marvelous to be true." Then the sunshine stored in us went on to say that some day we, black hard buried coals, stored so deep in all the great coal measures of the earth, would see the light of day again. And that wonderful new world about which we were hearing, but the great thing that the sunshine told us was that we were ourselves to take a part in that wonderful new world. We were to act in it and be of service. Well, how is it that to come about? We wondered. We are farther beneath the earth's surface than the bottom of the sea is beneath the mountain tops. How are we, who have never even learned how to move the tiniest part of an inch, to move all the way up to the light of day? The sunshine, in spite of our wonder, went on whispering in us, "When you are doing your part in the new world of men, then I too shall be freed. I shall no longer lie hidden in your little black bodies. I shall burst forth and perhaps shall feel how I become sunshine again. It seemed a very little time later that word came down to us of the first mine and the first shaft. Oh, that is to be the way of it, is it, we thought, and we were so eager that we almost forgot to be patient. Men had invented an instrument with which they could bore right down through the rocks. They built down shafts lined with iron and steel or wood to keep out all the water and quicksand that lay between them and us. When the shafts were sunk, they were like great halls, only dropping straight down into the earth instead of running along on a level. Cages were to be let down by pulleys. The cages were to carry the miners down and the coal up. So at last, what the sun had been saying in us began to come true, for some of us at least. But I could not see how it was ever to come true for me, for I was very far away from the place where they had sunk the shaft. How any small things, small and soft as men were said to be, could force their way through all the miles of coal and rock, to me, was more than I could see. I lay and wondered.